Let's see how that works out. Okay. So if you got a question, sing out. And I rough turn, somewhere, 12 to 1800s, 2000, nothing magic about it. And I'd like to use a spindle roughing gouge, anchor the tool, ride the bevel. By riding the bevel means keep the handle low.
Go ahead, that was me.
And then lift it until it starts cutting. Tighten it up if it slips on you. I'm turning a piece of cherry. No. Okay, so there's the other main view, and I can zoom in on that one fairly easily if we need to get a closer view. So once you've knocked off the edges, turn the lathe off, readjust the tool rest. So you want to keep a fairly small gap here that you don't get your finger stuck in there and you get a lot of tool support. Spindle roughing gouge to me is the fastest, most efficient way to rough a spindle out, but a lot of people just use a bowl gouge. Richard Raffin uses a continental gouge, and I pay a lot of attention to what Richard says, but I disagree with him on this one. I think this is faster and easier for me, anyway.
Mike.
Yes.
It's Bob. Did you paint your lathe?
No, this is anniversary model. I sold my B model and got a C model.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay. I've got it fairly smooth. And that next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put a tenon on each end. To do that, I use a shop-made beating and parting tool. This is a wonderful tool, 8mm high-speed steel. You can get this on Amazon. I'm an Amazon influencer, which means I've got a store. So, you can support my channel by going online and clicking on my store. And if you buy anything through Amazon, I'll get a small commission. But it's the easiest way to find these bars of steel. And they work. It's great for a club project because you can get them in groups of like 4 or groups of 10. If you buy one, it starts getting kind of pricey, but if you buy in groups of 4 or 10, they're very inexpensive. A lot of commercial ones are 10mm, which is 3/8. This is 5/16, which I just find a perfect tool for making tenons. So we're going to put a tenon on each end. I usually guesstimate pretty close on what the tenon size ought to be with this particular lathe by just putting a pencil on here. And that gets pretty close, but evaluate your own lathe to see if you can accomplish something very, very similar, because if you can get a relative reference, it really speeds things up. Now I use Record Power or Nova chucks. And the normal jaws are parallel jaws. Some of the other jaws are dovetail, but not the normal jaws. And I find a lot of people getting confused on that, and they'll wind up making a dovetail for one of those jaws, normal jaws, and then they don't get a good hold, and they wonder why they keep throwing things off the lathe. And it's because sometimes I advocate carefully read and understand the manufacturer's guidance and follow it until you have enough experience to deviate. And sometimes you do need to deviate. All right. Next thing I do is once I do this, now I look at it and evaluate the grain or look for cracks and say which end ought to be the top and which end ought to be the base. Sometimes it doesn't make any difference, but sometimes if you got minor cracks, that might be the base because you're going to wind up moving up and turning away. The lid, not so much so. So in this case, it doesn't make any difference. So I'm just going to move the tailstock back, get my knockout bar, and get the normal chuck. I keep everything pretty much in arm's reach. I've got a nice little stand or a little shelf that's got all my chucks and centers and everything on it. Okay, so we're just going to stick this in here. We're going to bring up the tailstock. Now, the sequence that I'm going through is the one I learned from Richard Raffin. He's kind of been my mentor hero. I think I own every book he ever wrote. And then I was just tickled to death to be invited to be his collaboration partner on this Four Ways project, where four of us are doing the same project with our own interpretation at the first of the month. So we've got another one coming out here in just a few days. Give myself a little more room with the tailstock so I can get this tool rest in there. So now I'm going to mark what I think is an appropriate height for the length for the lid. The base in this particular piece of wood is plenty large, so I don't need to be concerned about it. So I'm going to go ahead and just part that off. And in this case, I use an 1/8 inch parting tool. I could use a thin parting tool, and they advocate using the thinnest tool you can get away with, so you lose less wood to interfere with a grain match. The easiest solution I have for dealing with grain match is make boxes out of contrasting wood, like acorn boxes, then you don't have to worry about grain match.
Mike, is this cherry air dried or kiln dried?
In this particular case, this is green, because what I'm showing you the process. But it raises a good question, and that issue is, what kind of wood you use for a box. In a box, if the lid's going to fit, the wood needs to be dried. But there's a couple of ways to do that. If you buy dried wood, number one, it's expensive to get a reasonable size. Your options are very limited to either baseball bats or table leg billets, which tend to be kind of pricey. And then you're only typically going to get maple, ash, cherry, and walnut if you can get those. But if you turn green wood, it's just like a bowl. You make a twice turned box. Let me show you an example. Here's a little rack I have in my shop where I have, you've seen people got shelves and shelves of roughed out boxes. Well, I've got roughed out bowls. I've got a lot of roughed out boxes. Some of these things go back years. But if you turn it green, rough it out properly, tape the ends together, mark the date on it, mark the species, and set it aside, when you need a box blank, they'll be there waiting on you. And it opens up any kind of wood, just about anything. You ask me what time it is, and I'm going to tell you how to make a watch. Okay, so we're going to go back to, okay. So we got this thing chucked up. We're going to part it. I tend to use a shop-made 1/8 inch parting tool. 1/8 inch I find to be a really good size in it. It's fairly small, so it doesn't take a lot of wood. It doesn't have a lot of steel, so it doesn't give a lot of friction. For blanks less than 2 inches, I will tend to use one of these 1/16 inch parting tools. People make them out of butcher knives and everything else. Frankly, for the cost, they're not that expensive. This is a Penn State one, and it works just as well as a Robert Sorby, and generally it's quite a bit cheaper. The problem I have with the thin ones, though, is they come with a short handle, and you don't get enough leverage when you're turning a bigger blank. The other option is you get a longer tool, but they can get kind of pricey, such as this Robert Sorby fluted one, which is about 1/16 of an inch. It's got these little flutes on it, but it's got a nice long handle, so you can get some leverage. This works very well also. But once you go down maybe a 1/2 inch or so, you need to open up that part so you don't get it binding on you. Then you can kind of, what they call fishtail, go back and forth. And once you get kind of near the bottom, you got to ease this off. I'm going 2100. I'm going to slow this thing down a little bit, and I can just twist this off. Now we're going to go ahead and hollow this out. And like I say, what I'm showing you now is the process you go through in order to rough turn a box, but it's pretty much the same sequence you'd use as if the box was dry and you went right into it. It's just that a lot of times you don't have blanks that big. The general rule of thumb is the box dries an inch a year plus an inch. So if it's a 3-inch blank, you're talking about 4 years. And most people don't have stock sitting up there for 4 years. So let me show you a little bit about what the process is going to look like. Okay, so these are nothing magic about these dimensions, but it's something like this. The key is you want to make sure that your the bottom where you're going to have the flange is going to be big enough to fit in the lid. So rough turn one, come back and do it again and finish the box before you go to town and make a lot of them, or you could have, parts that are not going to fit together. Wall thickness is not really critical. It kind of depends on your design. If you're going to build a finial into it, you might shape it, for a knob or a finial. And then this is going to be the sequence that we're going through right now. And this is the standard box making sequence that's pretty traditional on almost every box. The first thing you do is the lid, at least if it's an overfitting lid. So in this case, I'm going to hollow this out, and there's different ways to do this. What I don't advocate is trying to drill a hole in it because it's generally not necessary. You're going to maybe make a little small divot here. Then you're going to come in with a spindle gouge, cutting pretty much on center, with it facing somewhere maybe about 930. I'm sorry, seeing that. Let me change the view here. So the flute, the milled area is pointing kind of to your left at about 9:30 on the clock. You're going to go straight in a ways, and then you're going to brace it with your thumb and just pivot it out. And it's pretty much that simple. We're going to go a little bit deeper, but how deep depends on your design. But because you're not going that deep, you don't really need to use a hand drill like you would on the base where you're going a little deeper. 3/8 inch spindle gouge works just fine on the lid because you're not going to go more than 3/4 of an inch deep, if that. And then you can kind of open it up a little bit. So folks that turn bowls, cross grain bowls, if you're turning the inside of a bowl, you go from the outside to the inside. But because we're doing spindle grain orientation, everything is reversed. So you're going to go from the inside to the outside because that is the best grain orientation. It's not the only way to do it, but it's the way to get your smoothest cut. The other thing you're going to do is you're going to kind of smooth off or true it up a little bit here and just slightly incline it. And pretty much now this blank is almost ready to go. I did skip a step, or I got out of a sequence. And let me back up and tell you, I'll show you that step when we do the next blank. Because again, right now I'm just showing you how you would take a green piece of wood and turn it into a box blank. So the next thing we're going to do is the lid. And actually, I got the same problem with the lid. What I should have done is, let's see if I can get it to fit in here. It might not fit. Yeah, it'll fit. Okay. What I should have showed you is when I turn the spindle, chuck one end, and before I parted it off, get rid of any waste or spindle damage from the end. So make it slightly concave. So if you remove that damage, it does two things. Number one, when you go to put it up, you're going to put it up like this. You're going to tape the ends together with the open ends out so they'll, the air can get to them. Mark on the tape, and I would also mark on the wood because sometimes the tape will come loose if it's sitting there a couple of years. Don't ask me how I know that. But by doing it this way, if you get into a bind with your design and for whatever reason you need to incorporate the tenon into the piece itself, you don't have to worry about having damage on the end. You'll know even when it's in the chuck that you could use every bit of it because you've already taken advantage of concaving this in and removing that damage. It also allows the two pieces to fit together and tape and not have a bulge on each end that makes it harder for it to tape. So there's two purposes to it. Does that make sense? So we're having a
Not to me.
thunderstorm come through here, so I hope we don't lose power.
It's not making sense to me.
Okay. Which part? Or dealing with the lid or the base? Or
Well, you just put the top end that doesn't have a tenon in there to turn that.
yeah, that's because I got out of sequence.
Okay, where if you had the
Let
tenon
me
in there,
let me show you in a way that will make that a little more clear, because that got confusing because I got in a hurry. All right, let's assume that this is the blank that we've roughed out. We've turned it round and we have a tenon on each end. Then we put the tenon in the chuck. Then we clean off this end. And it's the end that we clean off is generally that we want to pre-identify that that's going to be the lid, because that'll save us one chucking action. Then we turn around and put the lid in here, concave what will be the base, then we part it off. I got carried away and parted it off between centers. You really ought to part it off when it's in a chuck, because by doing that way, you'll have an opportunity to clean off both ends. Does that make sense now?
okay, but had you left the point of center from points, you'd always have that to do other things that you may have to do all along.
Well, what it leaves is damage on the end, which means if you need to incorporate this end into your piece, you're going to get around to using it, and all of a sudden you find out you might have a 1/4 inch hole, a divot in the piece that will interfere with your final product. That's why you want to concave it and remove all of that damage, as well as making it easier for the two pieces to fit together and tape, because you got two slightly concave surfaces that will fit together right here.
Or else, unless you left enough in that tenon for waste,
If you do what now?
unless you have already anticipated leaving those points on, knowing that you're going to waste that material anyway.
You could do it that way, but let me tell you, that's not the preferred way, because you still get yourself in a bind and you still got that hole to deal with. Despite your best intentions, stuff happens and you're running out of wood, and all of a sudden you want to incorporate that, but you got a damage. Solve that problem by dealing with it on a front. It makes it easier for it to tape together.
We just say, Gil, he's not going to put it between centers again. It's always going to be in a chuck.
Oh, it'll always go in a chuck. Yeah, once you rough it out and put tenons on it, yeah, it'll never go between centers again. You have no reason to put it between centers.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got the base now. So now we're going to hollow the base out. Again, this is just for drying. I've got a little bit of tear, a little stem tear out, so I've got to kind of clean that up. So we're just going to make a little bit of a divot. And that divot is just a little bit of a starter hole. Now, you could come in there and drill with your spindle gouge like that. A lot of people advocate doing that. I never felt comfortable doing that on a regular basis. So what I wound up doing most of the time when I want to do a depth hole is I just use a hand drill, and it's a 1/4 inch. Bigger than a 1/4 inch, it's just too much torque. Don't ever use a 3/8 inch, just too much torque. Smaller than a 1/4 inch, and it's really not as big enough to be functional. So now, and also I've got little notches filed or cut in here with a Dremel tool, so I can visually estimate how deep I want to go by looking at the marks and say, okay, I want to go that deep. So then I come in here, and I grab my headstock with my left hand for support, and then you're just going to go in here and drill. And now you've got a starter hole, and that starter hole makes it a lot easier when you go to hollow, because you've got a place for your spindle gouge to fit in. And meanwhile, I'm going to remove my live center so I don't get Turner's elbow. So I'm going to get that out of the way. There's more than one way to do it, but let me tell you, there are some ways that are more doctrinally correct. Let me put it that way. So when it comes to hollowing, I don't like to hollow much past 1,000, 1,200. So anchor the tool, brace it, make sure the tool rest puts the cutting tip on center. You're going to come in facing it almost 9 o'clock, just like we did for the lid, and then start opening it up. And then you just pivot it out. Now I find the 3/8 inch spindle gouge will take care of me until I get, certainly maybe down to about 2 inches. If it's going to be deeper than 2 inches, and sometimes depending on the wood, even less, it helps to go to a 1/2 inch spindle gouge for that hollowing process. Now, essentially, I'm now through with the rough turning this blank in order to set it aside to dry. That's really all there is to it. I'm looking around for my, there we go, my chuck key. So now I'm usually on the base, I'm going to write, the species of wood and say 8, 28, 23, cherry. Then the two parts, hopefully they're concave. I can put them together like that. And then I just use masking tape or painter's tape to kind of fasten the two together, and then I throw it up on the shelf. And then essentially that's the process. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to look around. I should have brought one up here. I'm going to look for this is green wood. I'm going to look for a box blank that I've already hollowed. And actually I did bring one with me, and that's this one I showed you to begin with. This is a piece of dogwood that I turned back in June of 21. Got some nice figure, nice grain in it. So I know this is perfectly dry. Once you rough these things down to, maybe 1/2 inch, 3/8 of an inch, I find that if it's in an air-conditioned shop, they're pretty much good to go within a few weeks. You don't have to wait a long time. And the reason is because they're cylinders with the grain running this direction. That's the straws, and the end of the straws are pretty short. So the moisture will come out of here real fast as long as you tape it this way where the air can get to each end. So we're going to start with the lid. If it's an overfitting lid, traditionally you do the lid first for an overfitting lid. And the reason is because once you do this lid recess, then you have to match the lid base to it. If you make a mistake, it's easy to fix with this. If you put a tenon on it and then you go to do the lid and you screw up, you may be toast. You've got to get another blank. That's why you try to keep your processes. There's, like I say, there's more than one way to do it that can work, but you want to have a process that will minimize regret and maximize the most opportunities. And if you run into a problem there, you have a process that makes it a little easier to get out of. Now, this is a fairly thick wall for the kind of box that I want to make. I want the lid to be a little bit smaller diameter. So I'm just going to take it down a little bit. And since I had the 1/2 inch spindle gouge handy, that's what I'm going to use. Just roll it over. Almost use it like a skew. This dogwood's very hard. Now I want to clean up the inside a little bit. And it is fairly clean, but what I want to do then probably to minimize sanding and make it easy to decorate the bottom, I would typically use a scraper of some sort. And I'm looking for one I had out, but I put it back. There's lots of different kind of scrapers you can fabricate. You can make them out of other tools. The longer you turn, the more bits and pieces of steel and old tools that come around that you don't want for what they were originally intended. This is a Highland bodger tool. It's a quarter of inch thick. It's not real thick. It's only a half inch wide, so it's not real wide. It's not real strong. I turned it into a negative rake, and with that negative rake, I can do some easy cleanup. The fact that it's not very wide, it's not very thick, it's not very strong, doesn't make a lot of difference because I'm not going very deep, and I'm taking very small, light finishing cuts. I'm just trying to get rid of tool marks on the bottom in order to facilitate sanding. Now, Richard Raffin says you hold the scraper and you put about the same pressure as you'd put on your hands, that you wipe your hands together under a hot air dryer. Don't press real hard. Then I got a little nubbin at the bottom, so I want to kind of work this up and down and across. Get rid of that. And now I've got a very nice surface in there. Next thing I've got to do is I've got to make parallel walls, not dovetail, not pinching in, not pinching out, in order to fit over the base. And for that, I'm going to use, people will use different tools. Different tools can work. Some people will use a skew. I don't think it works very well, but it works for some people. Some people will use a beating and parting tool. The tool that I find works best for me is a traditional box scraper. And let me show you what a traditional box scraper looks like. Basically, it's a scraper where this end has been ground down a little bit and is on a slope. You know, the number is not real significant. It's just what it amounts to is the steel is not going to rub on the edge except where it's cutting, because it's, you know, you've removed the steel that you don't need below here. You've got the same thing. You've got a slight angle on the very front, and the two edges come together at less than 90 degrees. Anybody know why? When you think about it, if you're coming down here and you get to the bottom, you don't want to scrape on this side and remove wood at the same time you're scraping on the bottom, because that, I won't say it's a guarantee for a catch, but it is a catch waiting to happen. So if you have it at 90 degrees, when you're coming down and cutting with the left-hand side, the bottom is generally not going to be scraping. Now, you can scrape with the bottom by just spinning it out a little bit, and that will move this edge away from here. So I'm going to go in there and I'm going to line this up with the bedway visually. And then I'm just going to push it straight in. Now, there's two ways you can see if it's parallel. The traditional way of doing it, which I never really got used to, and it's using a set of spring calipers that kind of hook out. You put this in the bottom and adjust it so they're just rubbing, and then you pull it out to see if it's loose or not. And I just find that kind of fussy. It doesn't work for me. Works for Richard Raffin, so, but that's one practice I didn't get used to. What works for me, as long as you've got a fairly deep recess here or mortise, is just use a 6-inch ruler, and you just place your finger in it, hold it like this, look straight down and say, is it parallel with the bedway, or is it pretty doggone close? In this case, it's pretty doggone close. I hit it right on the money. Doesn't always happen. Usually, as you come in, the wood forces the tool a little bit more toward the center, and you have to come back and take just a little bit more in the back, but not in this case. Then I'm going to come in here and sand this with you know, some appropriate grit. And I'm not going to do a lot of sanding. I just want to show you the process. Now, you slow down to sand. And I'm sanding the bottom. I'm not going to sand the walls on the inside. I want that natural wood there. I don't want to change that. I just want to get the bottom. And then because boxes, you want them to be little works of art, you want to decorate the bottom some kind of way. As a minimum, you'd at least want to put a couple of little V grooves or rings. And for that, I would use this shop made point tool. And when I say it's shop made, that means your ears ought to perk up and say, oh, this would be a great club project for a few turners to get together and make something like this, because they're very easy. And this is a very handy box making tool. This point tool, it's got 3 sides. And we can do that, or we can get more elaborate and use some type of texturing tool. In this case, I'm going to use a shop-made decorating elf, or what I'd call a Dremel burr tool. I'm going to make a little cove. Got to tighten that up a little bit. Going to make a little bit of cove with this tool. And I want that cove to be able to accommodate this little Dremel burr. And I've got directions on my website. You can find a handout how to make one of these things. They're not terribly difficult. They're about $60, $70 or so, maybe, if you get a Henry Taylor decorating elf, but you can make one for very little. So then you're going to drop the tool rest, because I like to keep this thing pointed uphill, and you get this inside that little cove. And hold it until it does its job. And then when it comes to texturing, you always want to like a picture frame, you want to frame it. So we're going to come on the outside and just make a little V groove on each side to help frame it. And let me see if I can get you a close up now so you can see what that looks like. And let me get behind the camera and zoom in. And now that I look at it, I think, well, I've got an awful lot in the middle where there's nothing going on. So maybe I'd want to come back and put a tiny little V groove right there. Maybe a 1/4 inch away from center. So maybe make another little one next to it, almost like a little bead. And then there you are. And you can get more elaborate. I could have polished this up. I probably should have with some abrasive paste, but I didn't sand it to, all the different grits. But I like to use abrasive paste for things like this to really clean it up. Now, for the particular box design that I'm making, I'm going to actually, I think I'm Bob, how much time do we have?
You can take what you want. We can go up to 9 o'clock.
Okay, nobody's having to drive, so that's good. I'm not gonna make a more complicated box, because I do want to talk a little bit about box design. So we're gonna call this kind of good, but actually what I would typically do is make a bead or a V groove or something to help disguise the join, like that, as a minimum. And now we're going to set this aside. That's what hit the floor, was my jump key. That's what I was looking for. All right, so we take that out. Now, the wall is probably a little thicker than I would like, but I would probably come up with a slightly different design, take it down, and probably put a regular bead there. But we're just going to set that aside. Now we're going to go to the base. Now, before we do anything else, we've got to set the tenon that this is going to slip onto. So we're going to use a set of dividers or a compass like this. Let me back out on this camera. So, we could use calipers as well, but sometimes this is the fastest and the easiest way, is to make it just a little bit bigger than this opening, like that. Then we can come in here And I'm just going to visually spot check it. Actually, I could probably go ahead and do it the traditional way, turn the speed down a little bit, and just touch it on one side, not the other. And hopefully where I touch it on this side, that circle will just match the other side. And I'm not even close. So I move over a little bit. Not even close. Now I'm pretty close on that last one. So now I don't worry about hollowing. You got to keep the main thing, because in the box making sequence, let me go back to that. We've done the lid, set it aside. Now all we're doing is making the base into a jam chuck. And so I've got to think about, well, how deep is this going to be? How deep is this? I don't want this tenon to be longer than this. And how deep? It could be anywhere from 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch deep. It kind of depends on your style. So again, I tend to use a beating and parting tool for this because it's easy to use this as a relative reference. I can make as long a one as I want and do it in one pass, where if I use an 1/8 inch, I've got to take multiple passes and then kind of join them together. So we're going to turn that on, and we're going to get down to, I think it was the last one I made. Now I'm going to just roll this slightly over to the side, slightly this way, to put a little bit of chamfer on the end. And that gives me a reference to say, okay, let's see if they do it a trial fit. Nope, not even close, which makes sense because I can see I've got, more than 1/16 of an inch. I need to bring it down. So now I square it up. I make it square, and then I create another chamfer for a successive approximation and see if that'll fit. And it's like, not quite. So now I square it up again. It's on a slope, but I'm just going to come back behind it and make it square, and then make one more little tiny chamfer. And take your time. Do several trial fits. Not in a hurry. Just enjoy the process. Now, production turners like Richard Raffin, they'll have rubbed wax in here, and they'll do with it running and look for a burnish mark. That hasn't worked for me. I'd rather take my time and just trial fit. Now it's just slipping on. So what that tells me is all I need to do probably pretty much is just square this up. And you want it very snug. It's not going to be the final fit. It's a jam chuck. And I'm going to make it a little bit longer now that I know what the diameter is. And guess what? I overshot it, but no problem. Remember, we did the lid first, because if we make this mistake, it's easy to fix. All I do is come back a little bit further and make the base a little bit thicker. Just have it slightly sloping down. And then because it's a little longer than I want, we just take off maybe 1/16 of an inch. And I've got a little bit of a line where I haven't quite smoothly joined the two, so I'll just kind of clean that up a little bit. Just dust. And now I've got a nice jam fit. I can tap it on. And when you do a jam chuck like that, it is really solid. And if it got a little loose, I could have put a tissue piece of Kleenex, or I could have used some paper towel, maybe one ply. But now I can finish the top of the lid. I can shape it around. I can do whatever I want. I don't need to bring up tailstock support.
Hey, Mike,
Yes,
Mike, can you show the schematic again?
yes. So we're at step 3.
Gene, do you have a question?
So we've done the lid. We have rough turned the base. We haven't opened it up yet completely. Oh, it's been roughed open. But now we made it into a jam chuck by just doing the tenon. So now we're on step 3 where we put the lid on there. Now we can do anything we want to this lid. I can change the shape, again, using a spindle gouge.
You can
And
show
all
it
this
one more
comes
time.
out of Richard Raffin's book, Turning Boxes, which is no longer available for sale. But sometimes you can find them used. And sometimes you get lucky and they're just very inexpensive. I've got most of my books used. So now, see, I can incorporate this tenon into the lid, every bit of it, and not have to worry about having a divot there. And let's say maybe I made the lid, I opened it up a little too much on the inside, so it was very thin. If you had a divot in there, you might just kind of be stuck. Now because I intentionally made this a little bit smaller, now I can change the shoulder of the top here, of the base, to flow into this. Like that. Maybe I've got a round shoulder. And maybe in my case, my design would probably be more like this. I would make that a bead, and then I would probably come down with this. I don't like to make just plain ordinary cylinder boxes. It's a great place to start, but it's not where you want to finish. So I'd probably want to have a little bit of a little bit of shape to it. Got to ride the bevel. Wow, getting sloppy here. And then you can do any kind of decoration you want on the top. Now, then you're going to pop this off, which is usually going to take 2 hands. Now, before we finish this box, we have to come back to this and relax it just a little bit by just taking off just a whisper of a shaving. So you'll have either a nice slip fit of the appropriate tension, but this is way too tight. But it's fine for right now. Now we'd finish hollowing out the box, getting the wall thickness in place, decide whether we want a bead here. And one of the tools that I like to use, and you can make one easily enough, but this is from Harbor Freight. They've got a caliper set for about $10, and it comes with this tool, which is very handy for, you transfer the inside to the outside. So get you a pencil and mark. I like to mark the inside. Then I like to decide from there, how much do I need to leave a thickness at the bottom? And then that's where I'm going to mark the bottom of the box. And then that's where I would go ahead and take an initial part, not very far. You don't want to get ahead of yourself because we haven't even finished hollowing it out. But I might still want to do some design decoration on the outside of a box. So for me to guide my eye, a pencil mark doesn't do it. Just a little bit of a part now fixes my eye for the shape of how I want to create any curve. So now I can see it a lot better and decide, okay, I want this shoulder. I can come around with this shoulder. I want the shoulder to be fairly high, the top third. And then from here, I'm going to bring it on down into this area right here, make a shape that, might look like a old-fashioned cold cream jar or something. Then I'm going to part that off. And to finish it, then how do you finish the base? You're going to, again, use a jam chuck. And you can either use the scrap of wood you've got left after you part it off, but a lot of times this wood is too hard. I find that 2x4s make great jam chucks. So we'll just take that out. And we're going to take a and I keep lots of these little 2x4 scraps in a drawer just for this purpose. And I had a box making workshop last week, so I had a scrap already made here. So it's just a 2x4. It's already got a tenon on it, and I didn't get it round all the way for what I was showing, but it doesn't matter. But it's a little distracting to have your jam chuck be kind of square, so I would just come from the outside and clean that up a little bit. I'm bad about not locking down my banjo. Not a good thing. Now it's round. So now we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to measure the thickness, but in this case, of the outside of this tenon. And we're going to come in a little bit smaller because we want the hole to be smaller than this so we can then adjust it. So you got to think a little bit about what you're doing and not get close, but give yourself a little margin for error. So then we can come in here and mark that. Bring this up on center. Slow the speed down a little bit. Doesn't have to go too fast for this kind of marking. Just touch this side, not this side. And I got that one pretty close. And then I tend to want to just bring out some of that wood with a spindle gouge just because it's convenient to remove wood. And I'm not worried about the finest cut, so I just happen to be going from the outside to the inside, but technically I'd be doing it this way. Except this is not a spindle. This is a square. This is a bowl orientation where the grain's running this way. So actually, you're really going to cut from the outside to the end. Next, I'm going to go ahead and use my box scraper again and make that recess. I'm going to come in here and pull it sideways to clean out a little more room. And now, here's a trick on making this kind of jam chuck. Do anybody know what the slope is of their Morse taper? Everybody knows it's tapered, right? That's why they call it a Morse taper. It's about 3 degrees. There's something sort of magic about 3 degrees. We're going to incline this from the outside to the inside at roughly a 3 degree slope. We're not going to measure it. It's just a very, very slight incline. And then we're going to do it again. Again, successive approximation. And by having that slope, it gives us two things. It's a good fit, but it also gives us that margin of error. I'm almost there. And this is a conventional scraper, so you want to do it at a slight incline with a handle that's slightly above the cutting edge. So now it's just going in there. So now I know that the outside is a little bit big, but the inside's too snug. So all I have to do is just change that chamfer a little bit because I had it fairly open, more than 3 degrees. So now all I've got to do is just steepen it a little bit more. And see how we're doing. Almost. And jam chucks seem like they're kind of fussy and a lot of work, but I tell you what, the more you do them, the better you get with them, and you can chuck almost anything. Now, I overshot it. That was a teaching moment. So how do I fix that? No problem. I just continue that slope and go a little bit deeper and then reduce the outside a little bit more.
Mike, do you put a hole in the center of it so in case it's too tight, you can put a bar through it and knock it out?
You know, I forget to do that, but thank you for reminding me. That is a great suggestion, and it is the way I would try to remember to tell people, but a lot of times I forget to do that. But that's a great idea. So we'll use our hand drill. I don't have a divot, so I've got to come back in there with something to make that little starter hole.
I see you also got your gaiters on.
Yeah. Yeah, I tell you, these gaiters are great in the summertime for keeping the chips, keeping your marriage together, keeping the chips out of your socks when you're wearing shorts. We're just gonna come in there and okay. Now I'm gonna open that hole big enough for whatever size dowel or steel rod I'm gonna use as a knockout bar. And then we've got it. All right. Okay. Close. I think a piece of toilet paper or paper towel rather will probably handle that. So let's give that a try. And it's still a little loose. So let me go down and take one more taper.
Or tongue oil.
Or tongue oil, but this is a little loose for tongue oil.
A horse's tongue.
Yeah, horse's tongue. Big old sloppy kiss. And this is too wide on the outside, so I've got to take this down a little bit. So I will come over here with that might do it.
Hey, Mike, it's Bob.
Yep.
Do you ever just put it in a regular chuck and use the jaws in expansion mode? Put the jaws inside.
You'll do that. You'll do that once or twice if you make mini boxes, and then you learn why you don't do that.
Why is that?
You'll break it.
Oh, okay.
You'll always break it. May not be the first one, might be the second one. Now I got this too tight, so I'm going to have a double of time getting out, but I'll show you another trick by doing that. But this doesn't break it. And let me tell you, that ain't coming out of there for nothing. So now you finish off the bottom of your box. And I'm not going to shape this box since I didn't even part it down. Right now, I would have a very difficult time getting that out. So we've got that hole in there. So I could take this whole jam chuck out and take a rod and pound on it. And that's one way to get it out. Let me show you one other technique that can be really handy if you use jam chucks, because sooner or later you're going to get one like this and you're afraid to knock it loose, afraid you're going to break something. You're going to take this down a little bit. We're going to do that. Now, because this is cross grain, I don't want to just take a parting tool and come in like this, because it's just going to rip this thing up every time it comes around and hits the end grain. You're going to come in from this direction. So we're just going to take our tool rest, bring it in sideways, and then we're just going to come in sideways. I've got to bring it down to below the end of where that tenon is. Now I can come in there and not worry too much about shredding it a little bit. This is not the best example, but I think it'll give you the idea. If you get to the point where you need this technique, it can work for you. I'm looking for my thin 1/16 of an inch parting tool, which I've set somewhere. It's on the floor. One of those other things. So I'm going to use the parting tool. I told you that it's gonna tear up the wood fibers, but in this case we don't really care. I've got this in my mind. That tenon sticking out of this is going to be just short of the edge of this parting tool. So if I come down here like this and then break it down a little bit more. I can get rid of this wood, and I can come in there and wedge this thing loose. And that way I don't have to worry about damaging this. And it'll pop it right out because I don't care about what happens to this. So that's another way to get it loose. All right, that's the basic box making process. Anybody got any questions on that before we start talking about a little bit about box design?
Anybody? Now's the time to speak up.
Or if it occurs to you as we're going through another process, let me know. Okay, let me show you a few different boxes that I've made to give you some idea of design. This is Bradford pear. This is just a simple mushroom box. You want to make the base fairly big so you'll have enough room in it to do something, you know, put something in there. This is holly and with an ebony knob on it. And this is an inset lid, not an overfitting lid. And I just use did what they call a Zentangle technique with a wood burning pen, a little pyrography with a little red archival red ink pen to put a few berries on it. And let me tell you, I know nothing about art. I have no creative artistic ability. This is just copying an idea out of a book. It is not real complicated. There's lots of Zentangle patterns out there. They're very easy to do.
You mean you got inspired from the book?
I got inspired. Actually, you know, they say amateurs borrow, professionals steal. Right? So this is a winged box. This was turned out of basically a rectangle of wood. It's not a bowl that I chopped up later on a bandsaw or anything.
That's also known as a knuckle buster.
Yeah, it could be. It's fun.
Got to be careful with that one.
You got to be careful. Whoop. Go back. There we go. Now let me go back one. Okay. I was in a class with Beth Ireland up at Aramont, and it was a box making, among other things, class. And she said, okay, come up with an unusual idea for a box. And if you don't come up with your own idea, I'm going to give you one. But with the understanding, if I give you the assignment, that's the one you got to complete. So she gave me the assignment of a padlock. This is poplar. It's probably, the box is probably close to 4 inches deep, or at least on the outside. And it's probably 8-10 inches across. And the hasp is out of 3 different pieces of wood. This is just kind of a natural edge little box, just a scrap, burl scrap with a really fine little lid. It's not very deep, but it's kind of interesting looking. This is not the best shape, but this is a rook inspired by a chess piece. I got a little carried away with hollowing it before I really thought through my outside shape. Otherwise, it would have been able to go in a little bit deeper on the outside and give it a little more shape. But it's still a nice concept for a box. This is kind of useless, little hollowed sphere. This is a fun project, multi-axis. You turn it several different ways to hollow it out, multiple chuckings, but it's still basically a lidded vessel, or called a Roman canteen. This is a box with feet on it, which are kind of fun, with an ebony knob on it. And that's the end of those. So let's talk a little bit about some of the aspects of box design. First, let's go to how you join a lid. So here's some examples of how you can disguise the joint, because one of the rules we know about wood is what? Wood moves. So you want to have a design that will accommodate that movement and not show a big gap. So in the case of the one on the left, you've got a large bead sitting on a curved surface with, just because of the bead, 2 rounded surfaces, you're going to have a natural gap there that would disguise any minor movement. The one in the middle, the tall one, is actually got a piece of contrasting wood insert that helps disguise the wood movement. The next one over, I think it's made out of Paduk. It uses what Chris Stott calls a sight line. It's about a 1/16 of an inch deep and about a 1/16 of an inch wide, and it catches your eye, both of the two boxes on the right hand side, and that helps disguise the joint because the sight line goes in about a 1/16 of an inch. One of them has a little bit of an insert of contrasting wood to give it a little different flavor. Here's another way to disguise it, again using let me turn this. The slideshow, I gotta stop slideshow. I think it's Red Heart and Maple. With a actually it's probably Bradford pear with a Bradford pear knob. So that's another way to disguise the movement, again, is contrasting wood. And in this case, you have that shadow line where the lid just goes into the base of the box a little bit and gives you that nice shadow line. And here's a traditional box where you just make a couple of V grooves, one on each side. So it's hard to tell exactly where the joint is. These are all ways of disguising or fooling the eye. This is a clamshell box. And again, because it's got a kind of a V separating the two parts of the shell, that kind of disguises any movement. And so some of the approaches you use are, a V groove, or the sight line, or burn rings is another way to do it. You can put a couple of burn rings on it. Beads are always a great technique. Having a slight chamfer is a way to do it. I find that to be kind of fussy. I don't use that. Then you have the bottom left is contrasting wood, and the one on the right contrasting wood. Those are all different ways of disguising the joint. Okay, now let's look at some how some boxes fit together. This one is a threaded box. They're a lot of fun. That's a nice way to join the lid of a box. People say, well, what are threads really good for? Well, I'll be real frank with you. They're not real especially useful. You can make a nice slip-fitting lid that will hold the top on about as well as threaded, but people tend to be fascinated by wood threads, and if you do it properly, it's very intriguing for people. And they're fun to make. And after all, wood turning is all about the fun, right? Here's that one we talked about earlier. Here's a different kind of lid. Years ago, I got a Sorby spiraling and texturing set, and I was texturing the outside of this Bradford pear, and it oxidized, turned orange. But anyway, I was making these different patterns, and I was having such fun and having such good luck with the patterns. I thought, wow, this would make a cool box. Oh, well, why don't I just hollow it out and make a box? So I did, and then it's like, oh, what kind of lid shall I put on it? And I thought, well, a spin top would be a nice little lid because you're going to chatter the top. So it's a loose fit that just drops right in. And if you recess the bottom, you can turn the box over upside down with a little ring around the outside, and it gives a place, kind of an executive toy on somebody's desk. You can actually spin the top on the bottom.
Hey Mike, did you put the lines on by hand?
Again, using hang on, let me turn this slideshow off. It's driving me crazy here. Again, I use the texturing tool.
For the wide bands in the middle? That was
everything was a texturing tool except for the V grooves.
Yeah, the V grooves in the middle, right?
Well, there's one on the bottom, right where the spin lid or spin handle fits, and then there's another V groove, right where the edge of the top touches the box.
Okay.
And then up at the very top, there's a couple of beads.
Okay.
And then this is the one I said was an inset lid as opposed to an overfitting. So when you do an inset lid, you reverse the order of doing the lid first. You'd actually do the base first, and then you would do the lid. Just easier to recovery if you make a mistake. This is, I never used it. It wasn't really practical, but it was in an article by Alan Lacer. This is a anybody figure out what this is good for?
Needles.
Actually, the size of this is it's probably about
Toothpicks.
it's about 6 inches long. It's for cheater eyeglasses, for reading glasses.
Okay.
Really thin set, but it's kind of bulky to carry in your pocket, so I didn't find it especially practical. Here's 3 other kinds of boxes. The one in the middle is the one I make more of than anything else, with different variations. That's kind of I think they call it an elegant box. This is a Beads of Courage box. So this is basically a large bowl, or a medium-sized bowl. It's probably 7 inches across and maybe 3.5 inches tall of the bowl, and with a board lid on it. But it's a lidded vessel, so you could call it a box. This is kind of a Aladdin's lamp kind of Middle Eastern design, where you could put earrings inside it, and you could actually put a ring over the minaret style top. This is burl with I think some kind of exotic wood, like maybe cocobolo for the lid. And this is a little bit smaller, about the size of my fist. Boxes you don't normally want to have a box with an opening bigger than about 3 inches, because wood moves. If it's a cross grain box, with a bowl style orientation, it's going to move more, because it's going to move in one direction and not so much in the other. If it's a spindle orientation, the traditional box size, then the wood movement will tend to be a little more uniform. But once you get past 3 inches, you start running into what they call seasonal fits. Fits part of the year and doesn't fit the other part of the year. So this is how different lids fit. You've got a piston fit. That's the one in the middle. That's the one that I had on that long box that Bob suggests with the needle case. And that's what you would use a piston fit for traditionally, is things like a needle case or a pill box. And then you've got the bellied fit down at the bottom. That's one of Richard Raffin's favorite. I don't much care for that, where it starts, slips on easily, then runs into a fat area and then snaps on, but the lid will spin. And I've just never found that to be a nice feature for me. I don't want the lid to spin. I want the grain to match when it snaps on. These are fun to make. Pill boxes. This is probably the box blank was probably no more than 7/8 or so in diameter, maybe an inch. And you drill it out. You drill probably a 5/8 inch for the lid, and then you come down about a quarter, maybe an eighth of an inch smaller than that. So the bottom is probably drilled at a 1/2 inch. So the wall thickness is a little less than a 1/16 of an inch. And with a little texturing that adds a little detail, but it also adds function to it, in that it makes it easier for you to pull the lid off. Like I say, this is an example of a piston fit, that if you've got a piston fit, it can be somewhat loose, maybe, when it slips on, when it settles. But when you start pulling it out, it creates a bit of a suction. So that tends to help keep the lid on there. So, you can put pills in it and have it roll around in your pocket, and the lid's not necessarily going to come off. This is one of my favorite style boxes, acorn box. Any two kind of contrasting hardwoods. I like to texture the top, and this is a fairly large one. So this one is, maybe the size of my fist, maybe a little bigger, a little smaller. And for the finial or the knob or the stem for these, I frequently will make another little acorn that mimics the bottom acorn, and I also texture that, and it just seems to capture people's attention with that kind of detail. Because small things like this, the more detail you have on, people want to put it up close to the eye and look at it. So it's nice to have good detail. Okay, so that's kind of box making in a nutshell. What else I can tell you other than answer questions? So what questions have I left you with? Come on. Somebody's going to plan on making a box. You must
Hey,
have
Mike?
a question.
This is kind of a random question, but why do you have green tape on the ferrules on some of your tools?
That's an excellent question. I take a lot of my tools to workshops, and it just makes it easier to recover them.
Oh, okay.
It makes it a little harder for someone to think my Sorby tool is their Sorby tool because mine's got tape on it.
I do that, but I use just my regular mailing labels I put on envelopes.
Yeah, that'd work too.
So that works real good because when we're demonstrating, sometimes the tools get a little bit mixed up. So I was
Yeah.
curious, why did you swap out lathes, Mike? I didn't realize you got that seat.
Well, there were a couple of reasons. I've got a whole video on the comparison of the B model and the C model and some of the, some of the reasons. But in a nutshell, I had the B model for about almost 15 years. And the thing that I disliked about it the most was the tool holder having this spike that would go in there and it never held real well. I've never tightened it up enough. I get sloppy sometimes, and then you'd hit it, it would move. You'd get a little too far out on the thing, and the thing would wind up pivoting on you. This has got a very nice pinch block on it. It's the same style that you're going to find on all the upper level lathes, the one way and the robusts, for example. They're going to have this pinch block system, which is very nice. Now, that was one of the features. The other, I turned on an American Beauty, very nice lathe when I was up at Airmont in a class with Beth Ireland, just to kind of see what it was all about. And it's a very nice lathe. Well, one of the features it had on it was a power disconnect, where you've got a switch on it and it'll shut down the power. So your VFD, instead of the light staying on, it shuts down. If you have a random electrical storm, you're less likely to burn up the VFD. Although if you get a direct lightning hit, it can still come in there and do it, but it certainly reduces your chances. And I thought, wow, that's a very nice feature. When a thunderstorm was coming through here, I would have a tendency to have to remember to unplug it. Well, the C model has that switch on it. It also has Acme threads on the tailstock, which are much stronger and thicker. And it's got a much nicer design on the tailstock. If I can move this inside, I can show you. So anyway, there's a number of different features about it that I really like. Now, there are also some features I don't like, but in this case, you have this quill, you have this keyway on the quill on virtually every tailstock made. Some of them just have a screw that goes in there. When you put, I'm sorry, you can't see it, right here. When you get a lot of stress from drilling with this thing, you have a tendency to, over time, create a burr that can prevent this thing from easily retracting and retracting. That requires some maintenance, and if the damage is severe enough, you may have to wind up replacing the quill. That Acme thread is a lot stronger, and this has instead of a screw going in, it's got a square key that rides in there, so the chances of having to do maintenance on it over the long term are substantially reduced. Those are some of the features. They also added 100 pounds to it.
Mike?
Yeah.
The tailstock on a one-way doesn't have that, to hold the post. That's a nice-
How does it clamp? It doesn't just, you're talking about a full-size one-way?
Yes, 2436.
It doesn't have just a pin going in against the tool post, does it?
Yeah. That's
Really?
I like what you got there.
I'm surprised because the banjos on the one-way are always touted as being really nice replacement banjos. I was almost, wow.
The only one, Power Schmatic's the only one I've seen ever did that.
Yeah, and the robust.
Yes, and the robot.
Yeah. And there are probably
feature.
some others. There are probably some others out there. Well, that's interesting. No, I didn't know the one-way.
I got a Magma 400 also, it doesn't have it.
Yeah. But those are the reasons. The other reason is, it didn't cost me all that much to upgrade. And the reason is because it's a business expense, so I get to depreciate it in 1 year, and it, you know, it was a pretty good write off. And I sold my old one for $800 used, more than I paid for it new 15 years ago, because quality sells, and cast iron, expensive cast iron, the price just keeps going up.
And also the fact that Power Mac makes cast iron dampens so much nice.
Yeah. Cast iron is just very nice to tolerate. It just reduces vibration better than steel or tubes.
Correct.
It's very nice. And when I was at Louisville, they had a special on these mini lathes, the Powermatic 2014, and that was the last thing I was planning on buying at Louisville, was that mini lathe. It's a 14-inch lathe, weighs 188 pounds, and it's just like this C model but scaled down. It has all the same features: movable headstock, movable controls. That's another feature this model has over the B model, is this the movable controls, like the one way and the robusts have. And that little bitty 14-inch has movable controls, movable headstock. It's got the same quality banjo with the locking pinch blocks on it. And they were selling those things at show price because apparently they had a warehouse full of them. They sold them for $1,000.
Is that 14-inch length or swing?
Swing, 20-inch between centers, or 20-inch.
Mini lathe.
It is a midi
Mike
lathe.
did a
Yeah.
really nice, Mike did a nice video on that.
It's a
lathe. I was
wonderful
gonna- I'm glad you
lathe,
brought that up.
and they must have had a warehouse full of them. They didn't tell the dealers about it. Pissed off a lot of the dealers, including one that I visited with, that I have a good relationship with, Ken Rizza, because he wound up buying one at the show because he said his retail price his wholesale price at the time was $1,900. So he bought one for himself as a second lathe. And mine was 2 years old. It had been in a warehouse for 2 years. But I think they cleaned out the warehouse, and they only had it. Then they turned around and offered that to the dealers. They raised the price a little bit, but not a lot. And they threw in shipping. I had to pay for shipping. And when you bought it from everybody else in the month of July, they included shipping. But even still, it was a screaming deal compared to any other mid-size lathe on the market. I mean, it blows away every other lathe, but it also retails for about $2,600. So the difference between a Laguna like I had as a teaching lathe, it's half the price, less than half the price, but it's not nearly the same lathe, but it is less than half the price. And of course, after that sale was up in the end of July, then boom, they're back to $2,500 or $2,600.
Mike, what was the name of that lathe again?
It's the Powermatic 2014.
It goes for $23.99
And that's with shipping included usually.
from Rockwell.
Yeah,
That's a lot of money.
it is a lot of money. But it's a lot of lathe, and I suspect if I age out and I find I just can't lift up big bowl blanks, but I still turn, and I decide to get rid of this big lathe, I'll sure be turning on that little Powermatic. Yeah, it's a wonderful lathe. But back to boxes. That's more than about lathes, and some people probably care about. Any questions about boxes?
Yes,
I
I have
have
one. Go
Sorry.
ahead. Just
Oh,
a quickie on the Acorn
Yep.
product the last one you showed. Is there a flat on that? Did you make a flat on that so it sits on the side, on its edge?
No, that's a good question. How do you set these? What I do, and I don't have one here, I make a little dish when I make these now, and it sits in a little flat dish. You can make them out of, a 3/4 inch plank. So it just sits in a dish that, not much bigger than that.
Have
And
you
that
ever put
keeps
a
it-
flat on them?
That displays real well and keeps it from rolling off the table.
Have you ever put a flat on one side so it always
No.
sits at?
I would never. That offends my sense of aesthetics to put a flat spot on my Acorn box.
Hmm.
And if the walls are thin, you don't have that much room. Now, an example though of a flat would be, if you've ever seen a salt pig, there's people that will turn a open vessel, maybe it's got a lid on it, that will be roughly the shape of this, and they will flatten it right here so it sits on the table like that with a tiny little spoon in it. So I mean that is a useful design for some things, but I wouldn't want to do that for an acorn box, personally.
Mhm. Thank you.
I had a question about, I remember hearing the measurement of 3 inches. Now, what was that again about 3 inches?
Once you start hollowing out a blank, that when you start going from, you know, it depends on the wood and your turning style and how sharp it is. But once you get much past 2 inches with a 3/8 inch spindle gouge, it's easier to go to hollow by moving up to a 1/2 inch. I would say once you get past about 3 inches in total depth, then that's when I wind up going to some other hollowing technique. And that's another reason why I don't make boxes, that are going to be any deeper than 3 inches, because then I got to break out a hollowing rig or use hollowing tools, which to me are not as much fun.
So for 2-inch, for a 2-inch deep box, you would use a 1/2 inch gouge?
I would always start with a 3/8 and then move up if
Okay.
I have to. Yeah.
Okay, so 2-inch
Yep.
or less 3/8 and 3-inch, go to the 1/2 inch gouge.
Yeah.
You ever go
Here's
to a
a-
bowl gouge, Mike?
What's that?
You ever go to a bowl gouge?
I haven't. I know some people do. I've tried it. I just never liked it. I never could get the right bevel fit. It just didn't feel right for me.
Okay.
It wasn't. Also, I'm kind of a traditionalist in that I've learned from people that learned the traditional way of doing it, like Richard Raffin, and that he always used a spindle gouge. He's the one that I learned how to turn boxes mostly from his book. So if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. I had a class with Stuart Mortimer, who does these barley twists and things. He and some hollow forms with barley twists. He had a set of tools that were basically heavy duty spindle gouges. They tended to be shorter though. Instead of having, like, if you get a Doug Thompson tool, you're going to get a 7-inch flute. Well, that 7-inch flute gives you a lot of steel, so the tool lasts a long time. But if you're using it for certain types of tasks, like a bottom feeder bowl gouge, having a shorter flute gives it more stability. And I know Stuart Mortimer had a spindle style tools that he sold, and it had a much shorter milled, it's just a shorter tool to give it more stability. I'd say if it works for you, it's nothing wrong with it. It just, you kind of got to try what works for you, but start off by trying something from somebody that you feel like's got a reasonable story and reasonable skills. Don't just go out and try to do something brand new or different, because most things have been tried before. But there's only about 3 universal truths that I tell people. Number one, if it's almost sharp, it'll almost cut. Everybody agrees with that. If you're going to cut with an edged tool, you need to ride the bevel, and you need to cut with a grain. After that, it's all variations of personal preference and how you learned. There are some ways, I think, that can work fine if you've been doing it for 30 years, but they might be harder to teach somebody new. So I wouldn't want to teach some technique that might work just as well if you're very, very skilled, but it takes a higher skill to do that technique, and may have no other redeeming benefit other than that's how the person learned to do it. Here's a style box I started making that are kind of fun, is adding feet. It's not terribly difficult. You have a tenon in here to hold it, but you've got this wood on the outside of the tenon, and then when you finish and you take this down, you cut this away. And I actually found I didn't have any power tools or anything. I used a coping saw and a Dremel style sanding drum, and it will clean this up in a heartbeat. and it just adds a nice little design feature to it. And this is an inset lid. Inset lids work fairly well on larger boxes where you want them to be, you know, a little bit looser, a one-handed fit. Another one of my favorite boxes is Bradford Pear. That's this one. Again, with Zentangle. If you're going to put a pattern like this with Zentangle, it pays to do this on the lathe and make these these defining burn rings on it, because it's very difficult to get it nice and uniform when you take it off the lathe. And then you can do all your decorating using a Zentangle technique. If y'all not familiar with Zentangle, just JGI, just Google it. It's just a really interesting, easy technique to add some embellishment, you know. And then it's got a little ebony finial on it. And then here's a style of a pill box. Got a little different shape to it. Handy to carry a couple of pills if you're going out for the evening and you need some kind of pills, or if you want to carry some ibuprofen around in your purse or something. It's nice to have a little decorative pill box.
Hey, Mike.
Yep.
Yeah, Richard Rappin often hollows upside down. He's hollowing with the gouge
Yeah, the
at
back
12 o'clock, pointing down.
the back hollowing technique.
Yeah. Do you
Yeah.
do that?
I have done it, and I've played around with it a lot. And the conclusion that I came to for me is that it took more skill to stay current with it. It wasn't something I could learn to do and then walk away from it for a while and come back and easily do it. And if you make a mistake, it's extremely aggressive. It will jerk the thing right out of the chuck.
And that's what again?
The back hollowing, I can show you. Let me the back hollowing
You got the
technique.
gouge upside down, virtually.
Yeah,
Oh, the
I guess you
gouge?
could call it, but he calls it back hollowing. It's a production technique. I asked Nick Cook, who's a noted turner here in the Atlanta area, production turner, and I asked him what he thought of the back hollowing technique, and he just kind of he didn't roll his eyes, but he said he thought it was a parlor trick. I think for a hobby turner, I think it probably is a parlor trick. If you're a production turner turning 1,000 little scoops to sell a year, then time is money. And if you can save a few moments by having a particular technique, then, you know, it might be a good technique. But if the time saved is offset by jerking the thing out of the chuck occasionally, or causing you to increase your laundry bill, you know, what's the value? So let me show you. And I think you can probably get a better view if I use this. Okay. So basically you're cutting with the top of the flute, and you're coming in like this. And then you're going to come up like this. Let me get rid of that little part on the bottom. And then when you come down, you're still cutting. So you're cutting going up, and you're cutting going down. Up and down. And you're
Yeah, I remember
keep
seeing
the
Liam O'Neill do
opening
that.
fairly narrow. So actually you can have this opening be the support of your tool, and the tool may not even be touching the tool rest. But you have to keep this opening kind of small. And if you don't get the technique just right, I have a tendency to form a cone at the bottom. So any time saving there might be offset from me trying to get rid of that cone that might stick out, half an inch or so, depending. But that's because I never quite perfected the technique.
Okay, well, I've used it a lot. I don't go back and forth. I end up with the chisel like at the 3 o'clock position, upside down.
On the right-hand side or the left-hand side? You do it on
Right-hand
this side?
side. Yeah,
Left hand?
right-hand side.
Oh,
Just
you do
keep
right,
going
okay.
around to the right. Yeah, keep going till down to 3 o'clock, rubbing the bevel, and it takes the material out really fast.
Oh, it is. There's no question about it. It'll rip the wood right out. It's a very aggressive technique. I'd say it's one of those things that, you know, if we're in this for the fun and you're making a lot of hollowed, and it's only for end grain, you would never do this on a bowl side
Yep.
grain box, only
Yes.
for end grain. It's something to play with, and if you like it, you know, go for it. It is not something that I would necessarily want to teach because it is an advanced skill. It takes a lot of practice, and most people you're teaching how to turn a box, they're still struggling with, if it's a sharp tool, it'll almost cut. If it's, you know, you need to ride the bevel and you need to cut with a grain, and they're still struggling with those concepts. So you never get to the point where you could, you know, even think about talking about an advanced technique like back hollowing.
Done primarily with a spindle or a bowl also?
Spindle gouge, yeah,
Primarily.
primarily, and it's because it has a long bevel and it's got a very shallow open flute, so it clears chips.
Okay.
And this creates a big chip that's just ripping out of there.
On your spindles, are you at a 30-degree concave? or
No,
convex?
mine are probably closer to 35, sometimes 40. I might have a 30-degree on my detailed gouge, but probably not. It's probably no more than 35.
That convex, concave,
Uh,
convex.
yeah, it's convex. Just I clear the heel in the back to make it
Okay.
a little easier to
Yeah.
maneuver it around.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great tool. Doug Thompson sells it. It's got a much shallower flute. So if you look at these two Doug Thompson tools, both of them 3/8 of an inch. One of them is milled, I think, at like 40% deep. The other one is milled at like 20% deep. And as a result, you can make the detail gouge very pointy and get into small areas for details. But you can also, because it's not milled very deep, you've got a lot of beam strength here, so you can hang over a tool rest a little ways to clean up around the tenon on a bowl. So I find it very handy on doing some detail work. I do it for doing a dovetail, or actually every tenon on a bowl, to get in there to clean up that shoulder to make it 90 degrees. I wind up using this detail gouge after I've done the rough work with a bowl gouge.
Well, it's 9 o'clock. Any final questions?
I'll be around for a while. I'll leave the channel open as I put away a few tools. So if anybody wants a question, but otherwise, thank you so much for having me. It's all, as always, a lot of fun.